Imagine waking up to discover that 4 college students had been murdered, while 2 roommates slept through the night just a few feet away. No one heard a struggle. No one called 911 for hours. And for weeks, the killers seemed to have disappeared without leaving a name behind. The quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, a place where violent crime was almost unheard of, would suddenly become the center of one of America's most haunting murder investigations. But what happened inside that house during the early hours of November 13th, 2022, would leave detectives, the victims' families, and millions of people around the world asking the same terrifying question. How could someone commit such a brutal crime and simply vanish into the darkness? This is the story of the University of Idaho murders and the investigation that would eventually lead police to a man named Bryan Kohberger. But before investigators knew his name, they had almost nothing. The evening had begun like thousands before it. Students poured into downtown Moscow, laughing outside restaurants and bars, celebrating another Saturday night before the long winter settled over campus. 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves was enjoying one of her final weekends in town. She had recently graduated and was preparing to move away for a new job. Friends described her as energetic, ambitious, and fiercely loyal. Beside her was Madison Mogan, her lifelong best friend. Their friendship stretched back years, the kind that felt unbreakable. They rarely spent time apart, and that night was no different. Across town, Zana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin were also spending the evening together. Ethan, a freshman and triplet, was known for his easy smile and contagious optimism. Zana's friends remembered her as compassionate, outgoing, and someone who could light up an entire room. By every account, it was an ordinary Saturday night. There was no indication that within hours, their lives would be over. The off-campus home at 1122 King Road was well known among students. Friends came and went frequently. Lights stayed on late into the night. Music, laughter, visitors. It was the kind of house where people rarely questioned seeing someone walk through the front door. In many ways, that familiarity made it feel safe. But sometimes, what feels safest can become the easiest place to hide in plain sight. As the early hours of Sunday morning approached, each of the 4 students returned home. The neighborhood slowly fell quiet. Porch lights glowed against the freezing November air. Inside the house, bedroom doors closed one by one. The night seemed to be ending peacefully. Then, sometime after 4 a.m., someone entered the house. Investigators would later conclude that the attacks happened in an incredibly short span of time. Within minutes, 4 young lives had been taken. The violence was swift, deliberate, and over almost as quickly as it began. Yet somehow, 2 other roommates inside the same home survived. One of them would later tell investigators that she heard unusual sounds during the night and at one point briefly saw an unfamiliar man dressed in dark clothing with a mask covering his nose and mouth walking past her before leaving through a sliding glass door. Then, silence. The figure disappeared into the darkness. Morning eventually arrived. The house remained strangely quiet. Hours passed. Friends began arriving. Then, just before noon, someone placed a frantic 911 call. Within minutes, Moscow police officers flooded the property. Seasoned investigators quickly realized this was unlike anything the town had ever experienced. 4 homicide victims. No immediate suspect. No obvious motive, no murder weapon recovered, and a crime scene so complex that investigators knew one mistake could cost them the truth forever. Outside, yellow crime scene tape stretched across King Road. Students gathered in stunned silence. Parents began calling their children. News helicopters circled overhead. What had started as an ordinary college weekend had become a national nightmare. As detectives searched every room, they discovered pieces of evidence that would become critical to the investigation. Some clues were obvious. Others were so small they could easily have been overlooked. At that moment, investigators still didn't know whose fingerprints they belonged to. They didn't know whose DNA they might uncover. And they certainly didn't know that somewhere hundreds of miles away, the person responsible was already trying to return to normal life. For weeks, fear spread across Moscow. Students locked their doors. Parents begged their children to come home. Rumors exploded across social media. Every unfamiliar face became a possible suspect. Every rumor seemed believable. Every theory found an audience. But while the public searched for answers, detectives remained remarkably quiet. Because hidden inside thousands of hours of surveillance footage, millions of digital records, and one tiny piece of evidence left behind in a bedroom was a trail that would eventually point towards someone who believed he had committed the perfect crime. He hadn't. The first 48 hours after the murders were a race against time. Every passing minute meant memories faded. Surveillance footage was overwritten. Vehicles disappeared onto distant highways. Potential witnesses returned to their normal lives. Detectives knew they weren't simply investigating a homicide. They were chasing someone who had already slipped into the darkness. More than 100 investigators from local police, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI descended on Moscow. The quiet college town transformed into the center of one of the largest homicide investigations in the state's history. The crime scene at 1122 King Road became a maze of forensic specialists. Every footprint was photographed. Every fingerprint was examined. Every fiber, every strand of hair, every trace of DNA was collected with painstaking care. The investigators weren't looking for one dramatic breakthrough. They were searching for hundreds of tiny details that, when assembled, might reveal the truth. Because experienced detectives know something many killers don't. People can hide their faces, they can dispose of clothing, they can clean a weapon, but they almost never erase every trace of themselves. Somewhere inside that house, the killer had made a mistake. The challenge was finding it. Outside the crime scene, another team of investigators focused on something very different: security cameras, doorbell cameras, business surveillance systems, traffic cameras, private residences, anything that might have recorded movement during those crucial early morning hours. The process was exhausting. Investigators spent countless hours watching empty streets, parked cars, and quiet intersections. Most of the footage showed nothing, but then a pattern began to emerge: a white sedan. It appeared near the King Road neighborhood multiple times during the early morning hours. The vehicle wasn't speeding. It wasn't driving erratically. Instead, it seemed to circle the area again and again, almost as if the driver was waiting or watching. Then, shortly after the estimated time of the murders, the same vehicle was seen leaving the neighborhood at a noticeably higher speed. At first, detectives had only grainy footage: no license plate, No driver's face, just the outline of a white sedan disappearing into the night. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect, but it was enough to ask an important question. Who was driving that car? As forensic teams continued examining the crime scene, another discovery quietly changed the direction of the investigation. Near one of the victims, investigators recovered a tan leather knife sheath. At first glance, it seemed like just another item inside a chaotic crime scene. But one detail immediately caught the attention of forensic experts. A small area on the snap of the sheath contained what appeared to be touch DNA. It was tiny, barely visible, yet sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence speak the loudest. Investigators rushed to preserve the sample. No one knew whose DNA it belonged to. Not yet. But if it could be matched to a person, the investigation might finally have a name. Meanwhile, fear continued to spread across Moscow. Students looked over their shoulders walking to class. Local businesses closed earlier than usual. Parents questioned whether the killer was still in town. The lack of an arrest fueled endless speculation. Social media became flooded with theories. Friends, neighbors, classmates, professors, even innocent bystanders found themselves accused online. For investigators, the noise created a new problem. Thousands of tips poured in. Some were helpful. Most were dead ends. Every lead had to be checked. Every rumor had to be separated from fact. Because while the internet searched for suspects, detectives relied on evidence. Evidence doesn't care about opinions. Evidence tells its own story. Weeks into the investigation, the FBI issued a public request that immediately captured national attention. They were looking for the occupants of a white Hyundai Elantra, believed to have been in the area during the early morning hours of November 13th. The announcement changed everything. Police departments across the country began checking registrations. Officers searched parking lots. Tips poured in from every state. Thousands of white Elantras suddenly became part of the investigation. Finding the right one would be like searching for a single snowflake in a blizzard. But somewhere, one of those vehicles belonged to the person detectives were looking for. Then another clue emerged. Investigators analyzed historical cell phone records from the area surrounding King Road. Among thousands of devices moving through Moscow, one phone stood out. According to investigators, it had been in the vicinity of the King Road residence on numerous occasions before the murders. Late at night, early in the morning, repeated visits that investigators would later describe as significant. Then came the night of November 13th. According to court documents, the phone's reported location data stopped transmitting for a period that overlapped with the estimated time of the killings before becoming active again as the suspect vehicle was believed to be leaving the area. Standing alone, that information proved nothing. Phones lose signal, people turn them off. Data has limits. But detectives weren't building a case around a single clue. They were building a puzzle, and little by little, the pieces were beginning to fit. The white sedan, the knife sheath, the cell phone records. Individually, each clue raised questions. Together, they began pointing toward someone who had managed to stay completely outside the public spotlight. A man living less than 10 miles away, across the state line in Pullman, Washington. A graduate student, quiet, intelligent, studying criminal justice. His name had not yet appeared in the headlines. But investigators were about to take a very close look at him. And once they did, they would discover that the trail they had been following for weeks was leading directly to Bryan Kohberger. For nearly 7 weeks, the public searched for a monster. Many imagined a violent drifter, a convicted criminal, someone with a long history of violence. But according to investigators, the man they were quietly beginning to focus on looked nothing like the suspect most people expected. He was a graduate student. He studied criminal justice. And while millions of people debated theories online, his name had barely been mentioned. Just across the Idaho border in Pullman, Washington, Bryan Kohberger was pursuing a Ph.D. in criminology at Washington State University. He had studied the minds of criminals. He was interested in forensic psychology. He had even conducted research asking former offenders about their thoughts, emotions, and decision-making during the commission of crimes. To many, it was simply an academic interest. To investigators, however, those facts became impossible to ignore once the evidence began pointing in his direction. But detectives understood something crucial. Interest in crime is not a crime. Studying criminology is not evidence of murder. If they were going to accuse someone of killing 4 innocent students, they needed a case built on facts, not assumptions. And that's exactly what they set out to build. The search for the white Hyundai Elantra had quietly narrowed. Investigators learned that Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra, matching the general description of the vehicle seen near King Road. It wasn't enough for an arrest. Thousands of similar cars existed across the country. But then detectives compared timelines. The vehicle, the cell phone records, the surveillance footage. Piece by piece, investigators believed the evidence was beginning to align. According to court documents, Kohberger's cell phone was allegedly detected in the area surrounding the King Road residence multiple times before the murders. Then investigators say the phone stopped reporting location data during the critical window when the killings are believed to have occurred. Hours later, it appeared active again as the suspect vehicle traveled away from Moscow. The pattern wasn't proof by itself, but detectives believed it fit with everything else they had uncovered. Meanwhile, forensic scientists were still working with the tiny DNA sample recovered from the knife sheath. The profile did not immediately match anyone in criminal databases, so investigators turned to a technique that has become increasingly important in modern homicide investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than searching directly for the suspect, they searched for relatives. The results pointed investigators toward the Kohberger family. But even that wasn't enough. A family connection cannot identify one specific individual. Detectives still needed confirmation. They needed Bryan Kohberger's DNA, without alerting him. As investigators watched from a distance, Kohberger left Washington with his father and began driving across the country to Pennsylvania for the holidays. More than 2,500 miles. Several days on the road, according to law enforcement accounts. Surveillance teams kept track of his movements while carefully avoiding anything that might reveal he was under investigation. Every stop, every hotel, every mile. The investigation had become a waiting game. Detectives believed they were close. Now they needed the final piece. In Pennsylvania, investigators quietly began watching the Kohberger family home. Then came one of the most important moments of the entire investigation. Agents collected discarded trash left outside the residence. Among the items was DNA that investigators later determined was consistent with being from Kohberger's father. When scientists compared that DNA to the profile recovered from the knife sheath, they concluded that the unknown male DNA was statistically consistent with coming from the biological son of the man whose DNA had been recovered. For detectives, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Combined with the surveillance footage, cell phone analysis, and vehicle evidence, investigators believed they finally had probable cause. The investigation that had consumed weeks of relentless work was reaching its climax. Before dawn on December 30th, 2022, the silence surrounding the Kohberger family home was broken. Heavily armed officers surrounded the property. Lights cut through the darkness. Commands echoed across the yard. Within moments, Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. Across the country, news alerts lit up millions of phones. After weeks of fear, speculation, and unanswered questions, an arrest had finally been made. But making an arrest is not the same as proving guilt. The legal process was only beginning. Investigators believed they had built a compelling case. The defense would challenge that evidence, and the world would soon witness one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent American history. The question was no longer who did it. It had become, can prosecutors prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? That answer would unfold inside a courtroom, not on social media, not in television interviews, and not in public opinion. For months, the University of Idaho murders dominated headlines across America. Every court filing was dissected. Every hearing sparked new debate. Every new detail reignited the grief of four families whose lives had been changed forever. But while the public followed every development, the people who loved Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were living with something far more painful than a headline. They were living with empty chairs at birthdays, silent phones, unfinished dreams, and the knowledge that nothing, not even a conviction, could bring their children home. As the case moved through the courts, prosecutors laid out the evidence they believed connected Bryan Kohberger to the murders. The DNA recovered from the knife sheath, the white Hyundai Elantra seen near the King Road residence, surveillance footage tracking the vehicle's movements, cell phone records that investigators said placed his device near the area on multiple occasions before the killings and documented its movements before and after the attacks. Individually, each piece of evidence told only part of the story. Together, prosecutors argued they formed a clear picture. The defense, meanwhile, challenged key aspects of the investigation and emphasized that every defendant is presumed innocent unless the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As the legal battle unfolded, the world waited to see whether a jury would ultimately decide the case. Then, in a dramatic turn, the trial that millions expected to watch never happened. In 2025, Bryan Kohberger entered a guilty plea to the murders of all four students as part of an agreement that removed the possibility of the death penalty. Instead of a lengthy courtroom trial filled with weeks of testimony and cross-examination, the case reached its legal conclusion through that plea. For some families, the plea spared them from reliving every painful detail in a public trial. For others, it meant there would never be answers to the questions that had haunted them since that November morning. Why that house? Why those victims? What was the motive? Many of those answers remain known only to the man who admitted responsibility. When sentencing arrived, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Family members spoke directly about the lives that had been stolen. They described birthdays that would never be celebrated, graduations that would never happen, wedding days that would never come. Parents spoke of children whose futures ended in a matter of minutes. Friends remembered laughter that would never again fill a room. These were not simply victims in a criminal case. They were sons, daughters, best friends, classmates, young people standing at the beginning of adulthood. The court sentenced Bryan Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional penalties related to the crimes. Legally, the case was over. Emotionally, it never will be. The house on King Road eventually disappeared. The building where the murders occurred was demolished, but removing a structure cannot erase a memory. For the University of Idaho community, the events of November 13, 2022, remain part of its history. Students who once walked those streets without fear remember how quickly ordinary life changed. Parents still think twice before saying goodbye to a child leaving for college, and investigators across the country continue to study the case, not because of its notoriety, but because it demonstrated how modern investigations can combine traditional detective work with surveillance technology, forensic science, and DNA analysis to solve an extraordinarily complex crime. The University of Idaho murders became one of the most closely followed criminal cases of the modern era. Yet beneath the documentaries, podcasts, headlines, and courtroom updates lies a truth that should never be forgotten. This was never just a mystery. It was the story of 4 lives cut tragically short. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. Their names deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Some crimes leave behind more than evidence. They leave behind silence, questions that may never be fully answered, and families who must somehow learn to live with unimaginable loss. The investigation into the University of Idaho murders proved that even the smallest piece of evidence can change the course of a case. But it also reminded us of something far more important. Justice can hold someone accountable. It can uncover the truth. It can bring a case to its legal conclusion. But it cannot restore the futures that were stolen. As the cameras fade and the headlines become history, one responsibility remains with all of us: to remember the victims, not as characters in a true crime story, but as real people whose lives mattered. Because behind every case file is a story, and behind every story is a family that never stopped waiting for tomorrow. If you enjoyed this investigation, don't forget to subscribe to Crime Codex Files for more true crime documentaries, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. If this case stayed with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us which investigation you'd like us to cover next. And remember, every cold case has a file. Every file hides a secret. The only question is, who will uncover the next one? Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and keep turning the pages of the Crime Codex.